seen the program that just about logistics, we are going to have two panels, coffee break. I have asked my colleagues to present only for half an hour maximum. So we have another 20 minutes at least for you to discuss, and we're going to have about 50, 60 people in here during the day, nothing coming now, I think. Please engage as much as you can. If you don't want your interaction to be recorded, you can say that, because this meeting is recorded. It's not broadcast live, so don't worry about this, but we are going to put the videos on our website. So yeah, if you don't want this to be recorded, just raise your hand and we'll stop the camera. Lunch will also be served here, so we're going to have some finger food, so you don't need to go out, given the weather, and we don't want you to disappear. And if you have any questions about the project, you can either meet me or my colleagues or our coordinator, our principal investigator, Mercedes, that she will say a few words about the project and the 3 years of travel that we had together. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone, to be here. It's a pleasure for us to share with all the, with researchers, with journalists, with users, all the insights we have got from this project. That's been an adventure, a very nice adventure, I have to say. Many of us asked me, are you very tired? It was very complicated to coordinate it. And I have to tell that no, it was very easy. It was a great team. We worked a lot. And it was a pleasure to coordinate it and to get to think and to get to know from bottom to bottom, up from the street, from the citizens, from the professionals, what is going on. So I'm going just to talk a very few words, but as a summary, or I'm not going very deep, because we have all the work packages leaders presenting their own insights and their own research. You will see that we have looked at the issue, the problem, that is what media are doing in our society in order to help the democracies. And we have looked at from different views, from the views of journalists and alternative media creators, from the view of media managers on the business side, from the view of the citizens, how they are accessing to news, and how these new content creators are impacting the public opinion, and also how technology is intermediating all these actors to do their work and to try to help the democratic system. So let me just to share with you an overall of that we have discovered. Mainly there are no new things. We haven't discovered a new Mediterranean, but just to get it from what we have talked to people, I think it's very, it's very real, actually. So, well, the first thing, and Vito was saying yesterday, that the journalists, the alternative media creators, and even the citizens don't share a common vision of some of the key concepts that we are used to talk about. I'm talking about democracy, media bias, freedom of expression, or threats to democratic systems. There is no common sense. There is no common knowledge of that. For example, for some, democracy is a legitimate and pluralistic form of government based on equality before the law and the separation of powers. For others, it represents the guarantee of freedom, the popular sovereignty, and for others, is the institution expected to solve the problems of citizens. Probably they are complementary, but there are different views of that. Obviously, we have realized that news companies face difficulties in monetizing news and informative content. This is because power, contrary to the initial idea of the centralized internet, has become concentrated in the hands of a few technology corporations that control the flow of information and data. I mean, that's not the only problem, but this is a very important problem. This concentration has weakened the business model of traditional media outlets, making them more vulnerable to manipulation and leading to an erosion of public trust. For journalists, for most of the journalists we have interviewed, and even for the content creators, the main role to act is as watchdog, to control the politicians, that they exist to serve the citizens and hold the powerful accountable. And this is a challenge, obviously. The alternative media creators, most of them in the digital realm, seek to reach niches and covered by mainstream media, not covered by mainstream media, although many operate under precarious economic conditions. That is, we'll talk about this later on. Some citizens are not aware of the algorithmic selection of news. Many do not perceive the consumption of disinformation or fake news as a serious issue, and some even normalize phenomena such as hate speech, in some cases because of cognitive and psychological mechanisms, like repeated exposure to this type of content, which has contributed to some kind of desensitization. Or the fact that in online spaces, anonymity and group identity can lead individuals to align with perceived group norms. In others, because of cultural and social dynamics, like echo chambers, filter bubbles, or group polarization, which happen more often in these digital environments. 6, I will say, there is a little public awareness of European regulation. For the professional sector and for some citizens, regulation is not a solution. We will talking about yesterday. Change will come which other professional sector assumes its responsibility: journalists, media owners, and politicians. The public debate has increasingly been dominated by specific actors, and the public sphere is no longer genuinely open. While digital media has expanded opportunities for participation, and we find some good examples of grassroots bottom-to-top movements, the public sphere is far from being fully open and egalitarian. Institutional and mainstream actors remain central. There is a biased representation and segmentation where concentrated media ownership and digital segmentation marginalize certain actors or issues. Mainstream media and elites clearly dominate some transnational debates. Regarding toxic content, this is the 8th conclusion I'm going to share with you. It's necessary to distinguish between illegal content defined by the Civil Code and other forms of harmful and detrimental content. It remains to see whether the removal of such content is the most appropriate solution. Sometimes it can be counterproductive, as the platform, some of these actors may reduce their impact in some platforms. But it can also lead to massive migration to new ones, potentially increasing radicalization risks. In other cases, we are seeing how some governments are using this environment to attack uncomfortable media in a performative way. I have to assume that this is happening, especially in Spain nowadays. Some proposed solutions include more funding for media, higher standards from politicians, and greater composure and professionalization among journalism. At the end, we recommend implementing comprehensive digital media literacy programs that empower citizens, especially young people, to evaluate information critically, and we encourage media companies to develop such programs to make more explicit how news is gathered and disseminated. So these are the 10 conclusions we got from what we have been doing research for these days, and really what I expect for this day is just to open a big debate and to a conversation with all of us, because I think this is a very important issue in our society. Thank you so much, and let's go with the agenda.
Thank you. All right. Now my colleagues from the University of Agder from Norway, they will present the first results. Democracy, Technology and Society. There we go. We can decide either to stand up or to sit down. There is a there's a pointer. There you go.
Okay. Yeah, so a bit. Yeah, I can. Let me move a bit. Yeah, I can do this. Yeah, I can video. Good. So what we're going to do today. So my name is Vito Latezza. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Global Development and Planning at the University of Agder in southern Norway. I'm originally from Italy, but I live in between Norway and Sweden. And Abit Ocha is assistant professor in the Nordic and Media Studies department of the same university. So it's been an inter-faculty collaboration. We've been together from the start with Mercedes and the others, and ideated the proposal at the beginning. So we're going to try to show today a bit the journey of how the project came together. We created this group that we called the Methodology Coordination Group, where me and Abit and Mercedes and the Navarra coordination team basically worked on bringing the project together across the work packages. So that's a bit the view across before the work package leaders and teams will present the actual detail. The title changed only slightly because Democracy, Technology and Society was where we were in the middle of the project, and now we refine it more towards regulation as one of the key themes after democracy and technology, but I'll share with you a couple of emerging findings as we speak. So what we did, the beginning, the basic brief that we had was really to look at how journalists, alternative content creators, and citizens operate in technologically mediated configurations. It was very clear by then the project started basically at the height of discussions around platform power, surveillance capitalism, that this was about platforms. Of course, this has evolved throughout the project into Gen AI as well. But our main focus, I think, across the project has remained on platforms. And as I already reminded yesterday, for those of you who were here, Gen AI is platformized. These are platforms, new platforms that are mediating, once again, media. So we do think that the platform emphasis is really key going forward, even as we add the Gen AI bits. The key regulation that we've been talking about today, I'll go a bit less on it, just because I know we're doubling a bit. Yesterday we had the whole session, and we can always share also the slides from yesterday. But the main regulation that we really ended up interacting with was the Digital Services Act. Not because the others are not relevant, but this is really the one where there is a role for users, for this kind of middle actors that we're studying to interface. The DMA is also important, but it's much more top-down, and then the EMFA came later. So we kind of discussed it a little bit in relation to the DSA. The EMFA is very big, so we're kind of focusing on the EMFA parts that are about DSA regulation. This was a bit how the work packages came together, and then each work package will go. Of course, we go coordination, but we have about 4 core academic work packages that then interacted with us as the cross-cutting project methodology. So VP2 working especially on journalists and professionalization and roles. We'll hear more from them. VP3 working really on funding and business models, the political economy of media. And VP4, media law and regulation, and also a lot of algorithmic work, how these platform algorithms really shape the reality of media. And VP5 really focused on citizens, and we'll also hear from them later. VP6, which was also led by Abid and I from AGDA, is basically where we try to do a lot of the exploitation and impact scenario and policy recommendation, and Abid will tell us more later in this presentation. And VP7, led by George and his team, dissemination and communication, also working very closely with the EFJ. So the EFJ, as you've seen, has been a key partner here, of course, because brought in the practitioner's perspective all across these work packages. So what was this cross-cutting methodology about? What have we done? Phase one was really more of preparation, but we've been, I must say, already very productive in academic terms. I'm an anthropologist, so I always take time, but the SEC team is always with us to publish before anybody else. So already from phase one, we have a book just coming out. It just came out a week ago from Turkova and Makova. We are one of the editors, I think both of the editors here, Threats, Disinformation and Regulation in the European Digital Environment. Basically, as a bigger team, we were preparing this context analysis led by the SEC team on the media sectors, and they already published something from that. So that was context really to prepare the first research protocol, so what we were going to do as an integrated team. And I think this is really what, for me, was very exciting. That I was very pleased to lead the methodology coordination group. We really managed with a lot of challenges. I mean, people were wondering, why are we not doing the usual thing? I got my work package, so what do you want? So apologies if I pull your leg. We managed basically to come together saying, okay, we can do the work packages, and they are very important, as you will see, but we can also offer something more. There's a project beyond the work packages. And I think this is really what happened with the activities we've done, and this was because of the fantastic work of the researchers. So it was 20 plus researchers across 8 countries doing really, really in-depth work. So the project came together. The phase 2 was really these mini ethnographies. We're now working on publishing a methodology paper. We think this is very innovative, not, again, the ethnographic orientation per se. Phase 3 was just more the analysis of that and moving to phase 4, and then there is the in-depth semi-structured interviews, which is the last phase. The phase 5 is the intervention and co-production, and Abid will tell us a bit more later. So the mini ethnographies, I think, were one of the most innovative methodological part we've done. We interviewed journalists, alternative content creators, and citizens across 8 countries: Austria, Belgium, Czech Republic, Germany, Ireland, Norway, Spain, and UK. The fieldwork was in 2024. Basically, we developed something that was more than just a semi-structured interview. It was still unstructured. It was not a full ethnography, but it's a kind of rapid response method that you can scale up across many countries. And here already we came up with something quite interesting. We started with 6 key challenges to what we called in the project proposal a healthy relationship between media and democracy: eroding trust, climate crisis, war and violent conflict, socioeconomic inequality, immigration and integration, gender equality, and LGBTQ plus rights. But we realized quite soon that especially for the alternative content creators, a bit less for the journalists that specialize more, these challenges really came into one big system of what our alternative content creators saw the role. The other really interesting thing that I think really emerged because we pushed this integrated methodology is that one key finding is that we were planning to compare countries. We ended up really studying what we are provisionally calling the European hybrid media space. The European dimension of these problems came up very clearly. Of course, there are context specificities to do with countries, national media systems, but the data really shows that there are so many other cross-cutting differences that are not so country-specific. There is something European about this. We're calling it space. This comes from the hybrid media system of course by Chadwick, as many of you will know, because we're not too sure whether it's a system yet. That I think it's up for further exploration as we go ahead. And of course, the attempt of the EU regulation is to make it more and more into a system. But I have more experts in the room. I already see the faces. They can correct more. I come from media studies more than journalist studies, so that's a discussion that we will have also later. So it became a study of Europe through fieldwork in 8 locations, basically. In terms of phase 4, we then structure it a bit more. So the idea was to get this exploratory view. We go close to these actors. We even did observations of what they were doing. We had some really nice visual ethnography part where people took snapshots of what they were doing. It was a really exploratory, participatory driven. The semi-structured interviews structured this work much more so that we could kind of systematize some of these findings. And there really the key challenge, I think we'll hear also a lot from VP2 and their perspective, because they also had a quantitative survey running, intersecting with the more qualitative data that they also carried out with us. We came up, and this was Andreas in the room who also proposed, and we're having discussion on that. The key issue was to understand how these alternative content creators fit, because we could see a lot of varieties. And how we define it here was a bit more narrowly than in the bigger survey there, because we really focused on content creators that were working on politicized issues. Whether they were political or not, that's a question, but not, for instance, corporate communicators, or they need to work with some of these challenges, some of the key challenges basically to misinformation, disinformation. So we came up with a typology that we explored through the interviews of agonistic versus antagonistic. And I think this is really key about understanding basically, are they complementing democracy, are they reinvigorating democracy, or do they see themselves as actively anti-establishment in a way that there is a polarization between traditional journalism and alternative content creators? I would say the practice is that even though in principle we could categorize them that way, in practice I think the lines are quite blurred. That's what's really emerging from the data. A lot of the sentiments and frustration with the traditional media systems came across even from the more complementary agonistic media. So I think that's something very important to carry forward also in the discussion with the EFJ and the usability of our work. We focused on professional roles and democracy. We'll hear more from VP2 on that. How people interacted with social media platforms and search engines. I think VP4 will also tell us quite a bit about that. Funding and business model is VP3. And then the regulation part that cut across, and that you had quite a bit, those of you who were here yesterday, and Mercedes summarized already some of the findings from that. On the democracy, I'm not going to say, I think Mercedes made a very clear point that emerged. The key issue here is the different value systems that are emerging from that. So this is not just a democratic dialogue between a shared values with some differences, but it's often radically different views of democracy, especially on the alternative content creator side. And again, there's more variety even within them. I think a key issue going forward, as we will publish more from this project, we already have quite a few outputs. We're working on an edited book from the previous phase, and many teams are already working on chapters. There's a book chapter, 2 book chapters coming out, also led by another collection under preparation. There's Citizens book also that will tell us more about under contract. The key issue here is how do we deal with this fragmentation, and how do we deal with, in inverted or in brackets, the liberal democratic media? How do we reinvigorate it? How do we take into account the fact that there are these radically different views? The radical democracy camp, of course, would take a more agonistic approach, as they say, but we could also say it ends up often in antagonism. You take polarization to the max and hope that democracy does its job. The discussion is open, of course. We are in a pluralistic project. Probably the discussions we are having is more of a mix. We still need to keep some values. It's more about renewal, perhaps. But this is, I think, a very open question that would be perhaps a follow-up to this project. The issue of platform power really was everywhere. I think there we were spot on, and I think even the commission call was right. Platform power is the issue. It came up in all possible ways, as you will hear also through the work packages, from funding to being dependent on algorithm for your audience, to being erased or amplified in the wrong way or erased in the wrong way. The issue that these platforms were there and people were aware in some sense, but they also felt, many of them, quite powerless. What are we going to do about it? The regulating media discussion, I'm not going to repeat it too much, but just to summarize briefly from yesterday for those of you who came here, I think our key finding is basically that the DSA familiarity is pretty low. And even the few journalists who know about it, they actually think about it in very systemic terms. They think about what it does to them and to freedom of speech or harms, rather than in article terms. So there is a gap there between the legalistic apparatus and the actors, and a lot of our recommendations in the policy findings are really about filling the gap. There's also a lot of disagreement about what regulation means. Almost no participant will say things should go unregulated, even the more anti-establishment alternative content creators, but what they mean by regulation is very different. Some people just mean, okay, if somebody's about to do a really harmful attack where many people will be killed, others say this is very harmful. If you're discriminating this group, the content should at the very least not be amplified. There's a lot of disagreement on that. Finally, from this phase, as I said already, there's a forthcoming book chapter. There is going to be in the book edited by Berti, Shavit, and Rupa, already from the German team on professional roles. There's the edited book on citizens fieldwork, under contract by edited by Picone and Trojan's Toxic News, how news users cope with intrusive, unreliable, and divisive information. And the OXO team is working on quite a lot on fact checkers, and we have several other articles in preparation. Let me be clear, this is not an overview of the results, it's actually many more. So for instance, the political economy work package already published 2 special issues. I just wanted to show how the work is coming together through this cost-cutting methodology. Abid, I'll leave it to you to...
Thank you so much, Vito. In terms of interventions and how, in terms of interventions of the project and sustainability, I can talk a little bit, but the VP5 presentation later in the day will focus in depth in the media literacy tools, but we will utilize those tools in what's called the Observatory. And the Observatory is a platform that we designed and in-house designed and hosted at the University of Agder in Norway, which is, I'll explain a little bit more in the next slide. What does it do? So far we have published 3 policy briefs, and 3 are to be finalized in the next few days, so tune in the website of the REMED, and several digital and physical policy forums were held. You can see just a snippet of imagery of these policy briefs, and you'll find them on the REMED webpage under Publications, Policy Briefs. So now the Observatory, so the Observatory was supposed to be a little platform that works with what we have as a result in the project, but in a longer term. It's mainly an experiment conducted on how to basically exploit further beyond the project timeline all the results and how to utilize these results later on. At the moment, this is where it stands. It is focusing on 8 challenges to democracy as identified in the project document initially when we wrote the project document. And and the workflow in this observatory, we are experimenting with teaching an AI agent how to generate text from the current media content. There is quite a few issues with copyrights, and we're dealing with that at the University of Agder. We have a very good team of copyright experts. Mostly we're selecting from prominent media selection articles and then preparing them as a digest in a new text that is kind of humanly controlled, if you will, or under a human editorial. And that is used for all sorts of activities, including training AI models in the future. So in the combination with media literacy tools, trainings of large language models, we are planning the next 3 years beyond the project scope to work with from high schools to other type of institutions, starting from Norway, but also with European Teachers Association and further on as exploitation of results of the project. But this will be the main platform for the VP6 to start working beyond the project lifespan. Thank you. Are we on time, George?
We have 10 minutes, yeah, sure.
I don't know if I should take a microphone or not.
Yeah, I don't know if this one that...
Gladly we are. So, Christophe Leclerc, I'm founder of the Media Euractiv and now leading the think tank Europe Media Lab. Yesterday there was an informal summit regarding many topics, but notably digital sovereignty, strategic autonomy, etc. Since years, I was on the high-level expert group on disinformation. We have developed lots of projects, all of us, regarding fact-checking, rule of law, editorial principles, etc. And frankly, the impact has not been sufficient because the big problem is disinformation on the GAFA platforms and also Chinese platforms now. So there is talk about trusted European platforms, a new development. I don't know if you have analyzed this kind of things.
Yes, because yesterday we discussed much more exactly this. And I was the one also making my own comment, not necessarily on behalf of the project, but also as an academic in that. That is really part of the discussion now. I would say, at least from our analysis, it's quite clear that actors don't really feel they have much power over these issues. And I think it's clear. I mean, there was one part, even thinking in project terms, quite to link to what you were saying. The original project call talked quite clearly, for instance, about, they were already talking about, okay, how do we change platforms, right? And how do we change algorithms? Of course, it wasn't possible. I mean, it's very clear. The project showed very clearly, even the fact checker study, you'll hear a bit more, I don't want to preempt it. The fact checkers themselves feel quite removed from the platforms, and they're basically funded by the platforms. The other actors we studied are even more far removed. It's clear that we need something different. So my personal academic opinion is that the ways to build our own European platforms, I don't really see. I also, again, I'm making my own expert opinion, not talking on behalf of the project, is very important for academic pluralism. I also think the DSA regulation will not work overall, even if it's very ambitious. By itself, we cannot just regulate. We need to regulate platforms we have a lot of control over as a democratic state, pan-European space. That's what happens in any other size superpower of Europe. They have their own platform, so that you have much more control over the owners, even if they're private.
If I may follow up, we are really a critical time now because these ideas are floating around various institutions in the media sector, etc. And at the end of March, there is the formal EU Council, and there is good hope that there will be some wording regarding trusted European platforms. And we all agree on the issues and the limitations of the remedies so far. So if you have clear views like what you just stated, I would encourage them. I would encourage you to actually publish them very quickly as press releases, not long academic documents, and as soon as possible. And we can also cooperate on that.
Okay, we'll talk later. We can add one more policy brief. I think we got the data to focus on that a bit. Yeah, perfect. We can link up. Yeah, it's an excellent idea.
Industrial policy and economic resilience. Think about the revenue side. Just one more word, if you allow me. 3 weeks ago, we had the Stars for Media Day conference, where actually Renate, who was sitting in the front here, was speaking, and many others. And I will not quote all the politicians, etc., because they all say the right words. The key interventions were by two advertising gurus. The market for social media advertising is 49 billion euros per year, growing at 6% per year. And it's very profitable. It's very oligopolistic. I'm an ex-strategic consultant, ex-DigiComp consultant. When I see a market like that, huge, growing, profitable, competition is bound to happen. And it does happen from China. Yes. Why not from Europe? Say it clearly.
Yes, I think the discussion yesterday went very much in the direction, so we will take your positive challenge and work on that. Yeah. Thank you.
Microphone is open for somebody else. I realize I've talked a lot.
Hello, I am Małgorzata Pakier, and I am from the European Network Remembrance and Solidarity. And so we are an institution that does academic and educational projects. One of the topics that we are interested in is disinformation, and mostly in the field of historical memory and memory politics. So what you presented there was this work task on conflicts and wars. Yes, so I would be interested to hear a bit, I don't know if this panel here is right for that, but to hear a bit more about the outcomes of it, about the practices that journalists have in collecting information, fact-checking, and so on, and what the influences there are and the tensions. And also, I would like to invite you all to, if you would be interested in doing some research or topics on media and disinformation in the context of history, then we would be pleased to be the educational partner for projects like that.
Thank you. I'll also pass it to Abid that he will have something to say from his report that he wrote on threats. So from the research point of view, let me clarify that those were challenges where basically we're looking at creators or journalists working on those topics. So we didn't study war and conflict per se or climate change. We studied how these media creators and journalists engaged with these topics. So we don't have at this stage a very specific analysis on that challenge from the data, also because it was quite clear very quickly, that's what I said was the change. From the challenge-based idea, all the challenges got quite mixed up. So we have some people talking about these issues in the interviews, but together with other issues, from immigration to something else. So that would be at the research level, but we might have more coming out in the future as we dig more into the academics part. But Abby did work on your report on threats, so perhaps you could tell us a bit more how you operationalize the challenge from a much more threats early warning perspective.
Yeah, I mean, allow me to just for 1 minute take and go back a little bit in history, because this is very important for this current project. This project was written also on the basis of two other pillars or projects previously executed or funded by the EU. One was called Infocore and the other one was called Repast. Repast stands for revisiting the past, anticipating the future, which is exactly the subject you're talking. And we, in that Repast project, we published a lot of work on historic revisionism and journalists and safety. So I think, you know, just for information, you could the web page still stands, and all the materials are in the repository. In the repository, yes. I saw it yesterday. Oh. In the EU repository, all the data is there. Yeah. And for this, it's for REMED, the subject of war came up quite often with alternative content producers, with journalists, but only as thematic discussion. So it was not, we did not really select war reporters, for example, to study, etc. But we selected a sample of journalists and alternative content producers, citizens. So the war in Ukraine and Gaza mostly came up in the subject. But in terms of building the resilience, then there's a really good report that is published on the webpage, the indicators.
Of the repast.
Yes. No, of REMED. REMED.
Yes.
Yeah. So there we have created this anticipatory method, so to speak, where all these challenges feed into the current state of democracy and what could happen in the future on the basis of trends of both our research but also other types of research. And you have medium, long-term threats as well, including for conflict journalists.
Simone Benazzo, Université Libre Bruxelles, ULB. Thank you very much. It was a very fascinating presentation. I got very much inspired. Two very brief points. One is more like a proposal. The second one is actually like a real question. So I'm asking you for an answer. So the first one is that in your presentation, especially when Vito was talking, it emerged quite clearly that there are different understandings of democracy. So you said that quite clearly. So like some people, some alternative creators, alternative content creators understood democracy in a certain way, whereas journalists understood it like completely differently. Well, I think that especially in order like to cross-fertilize like research, it can be interesting to link this very debate to a huge debate that there is currently in comparative politics and political sciences, which is actually about the different understanding. So for instance, there are many people here in Brussels that do research on like the census of liberal democracy. Because also in your presentation, it seemed to me that you use like, sometimes you use like liberal democracy, other times you use like democracy. But actually nowadays there are many people talking about different kinds of democracy. And I think that this is one of the key challenges that we should try to tackle. Because actually we no longer agree on what democracy is. And this is like a huge debate in academia on that. Second point, which is probably a bit more salient. So far, and that's also something that I got from your presentation, so far, we've been discussing about the potential effectiveness of EU regulation, especially like the DSA, but also the DMA, and like in the future also the EMFA. But we all know that we are slowly entering a different phase. So there is actually a huge deregulation push, like at the moment, also inside like the European Union. So I think that we should somehow like prepare ourselves to ask like even more disturbing questions. So not just actually will EMFA be effective, will the DSA be effective, but also like questions such as will EMFA be there in a couple of years? Will the DSA be there in a couple of years? Because we in Brussels, we know that actually the European Commission is talking about omnibus bills. There is a strong push from Germany and Italy, like in these very days, to deregulate this sector. So I think that these are key questions that we should try to tackle. Thank you.
No, thank you. I think on the first question, we just started hinting there also for our audience, but I think some of the work we are already doing in the publications in preparation is exactly that, bringing in political theory into media studies, which is not that it's not there, but there's still a lot of work to be done. And I say it as an anthropologist working in between media studies and political theory. So there, what would be really interesting in coming up with the more structured theory of this dissensus, conflict, agonism, antagonism. That's basically what we're doing with this data. I think what's also interesting to note is that I think something that we need to explore more also going forward as a follow-up is that these things are emerging also within journalists. However, despite everything, even though we had kind of hypothesized that there would be more variety on journalists too, there seems to be a core of journalistic values that survives. So I think a lot of these complete attacks on liberalism are also a bit misplaced, in the sense that many journalists do agree with liberal values, whatever they call them. So sorry for this very charged term, but it's also for the sake of debate. Centrism or broad-based. So there is an emergence still of these values of liberal democracy, democratic media that is still very strong. And then there is this variety on the alternative content creator side especially, with different views of whether they agree or disagree. That's where the agonism-antagonism dialectic comes. Of course, the key issue is how do you deal with this radical difference where you hear a part of alternative content creators, mostly right-wing, we have some politically, but also some left, saying the establishment is bad, we don't want to deal with journalism, you know, we are the real thing. The big question here is how do we deal with it? I don't have an answer, but that's what I think we need to work on. On the second part on deregulation, yes, I think that emerged even yesterday, and this was emerging also with this. I think this will be again follow-up. It's the new phase that is happening as we are, finishing our results and moving into more long-term results. I will still say, no matter what we do, even whether we have our own platform, we cannot have our own platform and have a complete free market libertarianism. I think we will end up pretty much like America anyway. So the issue of regulation will always be there. The point is, how do we make regulation effective, and how do we make regulations in line with democracy and digital sovereignty? I don't know if we should ask, is the EMFA there in 2 years? I'm not sure if it's a positive framing or a constructive framing, because it can also give in to those people who would like the MFA not to be there in 2 years. So I think that's up for discussion, but I think these are very political questions. So I'll leave it open to that. So it's more thinking over. But thank you. I think the interventions are very important. I don't know, Abit, would you like?
Anyone else? No? Okay, we can switch presentations then. Thank you very much. Thank you. Andreas? Thank you. I would like to welcome now Andreas and Thomas, who will present the work on journalism education, professionalization, and ethical standards. Thank you. I don't see anything on the screen.
Just to be clear. Did you send me your glasses? I think so, yeah. Maybe I'm such a mess this morning. I probably sent it to somebody else. Let's see. Oh, yeah. I sent it to my wife. Obviously, not functioning at a very high level.
Try again here, but maybe it's not.
Yeah. What do I do? Yeah, I can do that. Whatever. This is PC. Well, okay, that's fine. Sometimes you see on the screen, yeah. PowerPoints don't play on Macs and vice versa. Ah, okay, but they're both Macs. Yeah. I sent Chris, I sent Callum a heart. He said, I mean, just leave it now. I sent Beth to him. I sent her a heart. I sent you a cat picture the other day of the cat. Yes. I don't know how.
Yeah, sorry.
I don't know how that happened.
Yeah.
How did she that? How did it
I didn't know what happened.
I said, why is everyone sending me that? I didn't realize afterwards. Oh, I sent that. How did I do it?
I remember you were by mistake.
Much context, really. Yeah. No. I've forgotten that you were a cat person. Now I have to work out how to copy the point. So, maybe when I have my ears turned down, send it.
Give it a second. Yeah. I haven't tried mine again. Sorry about this. We're in communication science, but still technical issues. Can you please come back? Hello? 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 Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Floor is yours.
Thank you, George. Yeah. Good morning, everyone. Sorry for the long wait. We have the saying in Germany, was lange währt, wird gut. The good things take just a little longer. So here we are, and it's good that we had this. Is the microphone working? Yeah. It's good that we had a more general introduction into the structure of the overall project. Just let me point you where we are now with this presentation. As you see, it's a complex project that involved several work packages, and we were both of us responsible for work package 2, which was primarily dealing with the journalistic front, so to speak. So our primary target and objective was as follows. I don't want to read it all. It it consists of two larger parts. I will talk about the first one, the comparative survey, and Andreas is going to talk about the second aspect of this project based on semi-structured interviews. So they had different goals and different ideas behind it, and I will talk about the first one in a bit. More generally, why did we have this work package in this project? And I talked about it yesterday, and I apologize for the overlap between yesterday's presentations and the one we present today. Today is more kind of an extended presentation of what we presented yesterday. So the basic questions that we asked in our work package could be summarized by a long-standing question that has kept journalists and academics busy for decades. What makes a journalist and what defines a journalist? And even though we don't have a good answer to that question, we may have some illuminating information as to how we look at journalists and the kind of people working in the field of journalism that may or may not be classified as journalists. And I have to say that this is not a purely academic question because, as we discussed yesterday, the answer to this question has tremendous legal implications because in many of our countries, journalists enjoy specific privileges, and it's important to define the boundaries of this group, and that is an important legal matter and also has democratic ramifications in terms of defining who can actually enjoy the benefits and the privilege that journalists typically have in our societies. Basically, and that's a long-standing observation in academia and also in the industry, is that the boundaries of what constitutes journalism are shifting over time, and it's really hard to grapple with what is the gulf between journalists and non-journalists, and we were trying to get into that difficult area. Typically, we would talk about traditional core journalists. Some may refer to them as mainstream journalists. I don't like that notion because using mainstream, which is actually a heavily politically loaded term these days, would mean to appropriate a terminology that comes from certain political stakeholders. So we would probably more talk about traditional core journalists on the one hand, and there's a huge gray area of people doing some kind of journalistic work that we term, for the lack of a better term, peripheral actors. I do have a little beef with alternative journalists because if you say alternative, the question always is alternative to what? And most of the alternative journalists that we have seen, for instance, in Germany, position themselves as an alternative to the mainstream media, and so we get into the same political struggle that I just mentioned before. So for the moment, we stick to peripheral actors also because we investigate very different groups of people working right at the fringe of journalism. And it's also a side note, I mentioned it yesterday, that if we talk about those boundaries between journalists and non-journalists, an illustration as to how those boundaries are shifting was like when I started my career 25 years ago. Everyone was talking about online journalists as the new thing. So these were the other, compared to the traditional print and broadcast journalists. Now online journalism is pretty much incorporated. Then we talked about bloggers, we talked about social media, and so you see over time with new technologies coming in, and now it's AI bots, the boundaries of institutional journalism are shifting, and it's partly our job to investigate the way these boundaries are shifting. So we were interested in basically in two aspects. I don't want to walk you through all of this. in two aspects that we found most relevant. One is, to what extent are those people working at the fringe of journalism, either inside or outside journalism, that's up to definition, whether or not they consider themselves or self-position themselves as journalists. And that's an important question, because if they say they are journalists, you would expect them to follow an institutional framework of journalism. And if they don't, you may want to punish them for not doing so. And that is one question. And the second question is, what are the ambitions people have who work on these fringes of journalism? So are they different to traditional core journalists, or are there similarities? How do these differences look like? So these were our two basic questions. And this is what we did. What I'm going to present in the next couple of minutes that I have consists of two large sets of data. One was originally collected by REMIT. That is a set of surveys with 644 peripheral actors working kind of in a journalistic way in 8 European countries. You see them all here. Working in different areas. I talk about this a little later. And as a comparative benchmark, when we talk about comparisons between peripheral actors and classic traditional core journalists, we used survey data from the most recent wave of the World Self Journalism study, which luckily also had data from the same 8 countries you see here on the slides. So we can compare the results of the 644 peripheral actors with almost 6,000 classic core professional journalists in the 8 countries. So now, since talking about peripheral journalists or peripheral actors is extremely complicated by the fact that there are so many different types of people in this sphere surrounding the core of traditional journalists. And it varies across countries. So you may find some peripheral actors in some countries and you don't find them in others. So media spheres look very different. And this is why we focused on 5 groups of peripheral actors of whom we knew exist in all of those 8 countries we investigated. And here is the 5 groups that we studied. First of all, alternative media. So as you see, we are kind of distancing ourselves a little bit from the notion of alternative and alternative media actors we consider in the political sphere to be those using an antagonist approach to reporting. They deliberately position themselves as a counterforce to what they consider the mainstream media or legacy media for the most part. Second, we looked at fact checkers, and that's a theme that you find in almost every work package in this study. We looked at people or journalists who spent most of their daytime and work time verifying facts. We looked at new startups, so these are new enterprises that sometimes experiment with new techniques and technologies in journalism. If it works, if it is successful, it may be or may not be incorporated into traditional journalism. Social media influences, but here we concentrated very much on genuinely political influences. So these are people who have large followership on social media talking about political issues, and some of whom we reasoned may consider themselves journalists, others may not. And corporate journalism. And corporate journalism is something that's been around for a very, very long time. Just if you look at, if you board a plane, they have these magazines like Lufthansa magazine and whatever. So corporate publishing means that the target audience is not a broader audience, but it's a company's employees or customers. Customers magazines are probably the best example of corporate journalism. Another example, for instance, that illustrates how difficult it is to draw these boundaries is a magazine that we have in Germany. It's very successful. It's ADAC Motorwelt. It's a magazine published by the German Automotive Club and distributed to their members, but also sold in the market. So is that journalism or is that corporate publishing? It's always difficult to say. And so we felt it's interesting to look into how people working for those magazines consider themselves. So these were the 5 groups. There are more, but we needed to focus our energy on a selected number of groups. So these are the measures. I'm going to go through this relatively quickly. I was saying that we were looking at how do peripheral actors, in comparison to classic journalists, perceive their roles in society. So what are their ambitions as a journalist or as a content producer? And here we used some indices based on previous work, which was trying to classify different aspects of journalistic roles. For instance, one is the very obvious one, the informational instructive roles, which means journalism is about disseminating information and that's about it. Or analytical deliberative roles, which means journalism should also provide context and analysis to people to help them make sense of political events. Critical monitorial roles, it's the job of journalists to criticize the government and hold the powerful to account. Advocative radical roles, these are journalists who do some sort of advocacy built into their professional undertaking, so they advocate for social change, they want to change society to the better. Developmental educative roles, much more pronounced in for instance, in Asia, Africa, Latin America, where is the job of journalists to promote peace and tolerance, to educate people. And the collaborative facilitative roles that you find mostly pronounced in authoritarian countries, where journalists conceive of themselves as partners of the government, helping the government in developing the country, and the domain of everyday life. So journalists also function as, as people providing orientations for people in their everyday life. So not all in journalism is about politics. In fact, most journalistic content is not about politics, and we should actually account for that. So these are basically 7 different areas of journalistic ambitions and role orientations, and we use these 7 areas in our comparison between classic core journalists and peripheral actors. How long did I speak? Do I speak already? 14. Okay, good. I'm good at time. All right. Now you're probably interested in what we found basically as an answer to the first question. So how do journalists or how do peripheral actors conceive of themselves? And so you see the 5 groups we studied: alternative media, fact checkers, new startups, social media influencers, corporate journalism. And so you see some interesting differences. For instance, people working as fact checkers and in new startups, they overwhelmingly self-identified as journalists, and that's no surprise. Fact checking these days has been very much incorporated into standard journalism. So when fact checkers about 10 years ago or 7 years ago have been groups of journalists servicing other media to verify their information, now fact checkers have been incorporated in many newsrooms in journalism. And that's particularly been driven by the pandemic, when a lot of disinformation was distributed in the media sphere. New startups also very much consider themselves journalistic, and also their work is framed as journalistic, because these are typically organizations, and I also need to mention that there's some overlap between those groups, because actually one could say that many fact checkers have originally started out as a new startup. So, but people working for new startups who are experimenting with new journalistic techniques, with new ideas, with new tools, they consider themselves journalists. Now, if we turn to alternative media, we see a smaller percentage, but still the majority would say, I'm a journalist in the first place. The situation is different if you look at social media influencers. So only less than 1 out of 5 would consider him or herself a journalist. Social media influencers often also actually actively avoid being the label of journalists because their unique selling proposition is, I'm doing something that's very different from journalism. And corporate journalism, there you see a very mixed picture. Actually, many people working in corporate journalism have a very strong journalistic background. They've either worked for journalistic media before they entered corporate journalism because corporate journalism gives them more job security, it pays better, so it's a good alternative for journalists to escape from precarity conditions, and so you find a lot of former journalists in corporate journalism, and so the picture is mixed, not surprisingly. So, but what we can see is that the majority, by and large, among the people we studied as peripheral actors, kind of flag themselves as journalists in terms of self-identification. So many of them should be considered an important driving force in terms of how journalism is changing over time. Now, looking into their ambitions, we did some statistical analysis, which I will not go into detail. If you have questions, just ask them afterwards. I start with the dimensions that we have used for journalistic roles. These were the 7 dimensions that I explained at the beginning. And they map actually very nicely. So the arrows, if they are standing in opposition to each other, that indicates an antagonism between those approaches. And so the way these arrows map onto a 2-dimensional space makes quite some sense, and it's in line with the theory we used. But more interesting is our respondents are all the colored dots you can see on that map. It's still very messy, that picture. I make it easier for you to interpret. Just for you as to navigate this picture is alternative media fact checkers, new startups, social media influencers, and corporate journalists. They get a color assigned to their position on the map, and all the gray dots are the traditional core journalists from the various countries we studied. Now, those circles indicate kind of the density where you find most of the journalists' answers, and so you can see that there is a lot of overlap between traditional core journalists, not surprisingly, and peripheral actors. Peripheral actors are, for the most part, not so different from traditional journalists, but you also see some interesting differences, which I can go through in the next couple of slides. So, for instance, if it comes to informational instructive roles, you see, I mean, always the benchmark for comparison is the traditional journalist to the bottom. You see a higher appetite for informational instructive roles for fact checkers. They score relatively high on the scale, so the numbers that you see are the mean scores for these particular roles. Fact checkers have a score of 4.2, and it's slightly different from traditional journalists. But you also see that social influencers and corporate journalists have significantly less appetite for informational instructive roles. And if you go through it, I just want to point you to some relevant differences that we noticed. For instance, the alternative media actors have a much higher inclination to provide analysis and fuel political debates compared to traditional journalists in our analysis. But when it comes to critical and monitorial roles, so that's the classic approach to journalism in democracy. Hey, like journalists are primarily responsible to hold the powerful to account. You see that that's particularly true for fact checkers. Again, not surprisingly, but you see that, for instance, corporate journalists score significantly lower on that particular dimensions. What else is interesting? This is not interesting because there are not so many differences. The extent of advocacy, that is also something that caught our attention. So traditional journalism would mostly try to avoid advocacy as part of journalism. And this is indicated by the relatively low score for traditional journalists. But that's different for alternative media actors. So alternative media actors define themselves by making a radical and advocacy contribution to political discourse. And that's actually true for many other of these groups, but it's particularly the case for alternative media actors. I'm not going to mention this, and everyday life-related roles may or may not be interested, but because I have relatively little time for this part, because Andreas has also something to report from the qualitative study, and I would give him some time for that. Overall, I would say that what we found is, on the one hand, that there is a significant overlap between traditional core journalists and people working on the periphery of journalism. That's one thing, and that didn't quite surprise us. But what we can see if we look at peripheral actors, we do see some boundaries shifting towards a more interventionist approach to reporting. So many of the people working at the fringe of journalism are very much driven by an impetus to make an active intervention into political discourse and society. So the idea is to change things, and that's something that is different from professional core journalists. And what we can also see is that in this picture, also in other studies, is that the various groups of actors operating right at the fringe of journalism are kind of contributing to a professional discourse within journalism, within the industry, which is about renegotiating their boundaries. And I've had many discussions yesterday with several people, some present in the room, which is about how do we define journalists in a modern media world? How do we define the group of people we give special privilege to? And so we can see that people working at the boundary of journalism or behind the boundaries of journalism are contributing to an ongoing shift in journalism's professional boundaries, and how this plays out in practice. I mean, I've been talking about journalistic ambitions, and that doesn't necessarily mean that those journalistic ambitions make it into their practice. So how it plays out in the practice of journalism, that's something that Andreas is going to talk about. So I hand over to you.
Thank you, Thomas. So it will be a little subject change now, because in our working package we had some tasks which we answered with the comparative survey which Thomas just presented, but we also had another task which we answered with the cross-cutting methodology Vitor mentioned at the beginning, and that is the question how the roles of journalists might change in declining democracies. So the starting point is kind of that we treated democracy and journalism for a long time as kind of two sides of one coin. So Sternberg, for instance, called it 20 years ago a social contract between democracy and journalism. And while research has demonstrated that journalism can... Don't you hear something?
No, I can hear you. I just have... Could you tell me what a declining democracy is?
I think that's what I'm going to talk about right now. So while we always thought journalism and democracy are kind of bound to each other, research has demonstrated that journalism can very well exist in non-democratic regimes. But we still assume that democracy needs functional journalism. But what we see now, we see that this kind of contract gets broken from one side. We see that political elites increasingly disrespect democratic norms, disrespect democratic institutions, and that is exactly captured by the idea of democratic backsliding. So to define democratic backsliding, as I've been just asked to do so, we would understand it as the deterioration of qualities associated with democratic governance. So democratic backsliding is not necessarily a sudden and an immediate system change, but it is the increasing decline of equality of democracy. And that is something which we see in the exact countries of our study. So I brought you here the development of the Liberal Democracy Index by the VDIM Institute over the last 15 years, which captures aspects like free elections, freedom of expression, or equality before the law. And we see that within the last 15 years, all of the countries we studied, with the only exception of Czechia, they experience exactly this decline of the quality of democracy. And that has, of course, consequences for journalism. Consequences like limited press freedom, like strategic lawsuits against them, so-called slaps, physical, but also psychological threats. So we expect that in the long run, this might also change the institutional logic of journalism, because democracy and journalism have been institutionally bound to each other. But on the other hand, we know that journalistic values are relatively stable. So we have data from the US, for instance, where journalistic roles are relatively stable over several decades. And that's why we expect that in the first place, we might see that journalists experience disruptions in the role enactment. So what do we mean with role enactment? We work with this process model of journalistic roles here, which expect that journalists have certain role orientations, which express what they want to do in their work. And during the process of role enactment, they are translated into professional practices. So the role enactment is the process how the roles are materialized in news decisions and journalistic reporting. And we expect that this is the place where we might see the first influence of democratic backsliding. Because we know that this process is influenced by a couple of factors from the working environment of journalists, and we ask whether democratic backsliding might be one of these factors which impact the enactment of certain roles. So first of all, we ask how these patterns of democratic backsliding create tensions in between what journalists want to do and what they can actually do in the political environment. And second, which coping strategies these journalists develop. And we answer these two questions by 30 semi-structured interviews, which we took in 6 countries of our project, Austria, Czechia, Germany, Norway, Spain, and the UK. We confronted the journalists with a card sorting task, so we confronted them with 18 predefined roles to kind of initiate a broad reflection on potential roles of journalism. We then asked them about their perception of democratic backsliding in their countries, and the potential impact on the enactment of exactly these roles they deemed important in the card sorting tasks. And we also asked them for the coping strategies. We then analyzed the data using qualitative content analysis, and this analysis revealed 3 broader patterns of disrupted role enactment due to democratic decline. I will explain a bit in detail. So first, our respondents articulate that they perceive a strongly constrained enactment of critical and also of monitorial roles. For instance, the classical watchdog role. That's something they report is not possible to an extent anymore as we wanted to. Journalists from different countries explain that they face external barriers, which can be lawsuits, which can be the restricted access to information, but can also be personal threats. And as a response, a lot of respondents talk about increasing fatigue and resignation. They simply give up telling things how one respondent from Spain notes in our interviews. This is especially the case in the interaction with sources, especially with political sources, where journalists report difficulties in accessing them and also in cooperating with them. As a consequence, many respondents in our interviews told that they kind of move towards more collaborative, facilitative roles which more strongly resemble the strategic interest of political actors. As another journalist from Spain says, the reality is that many times, alien to the journalistic work, we end up supporting governments and elites. Yet, and I think that's important to note, that role kind of again creates tensions with normative roles, because collaborative role is something the majority of our respondents would reject under normal circumstances. Secondly, we find that journalists perceive clear limits of enacting informational roles without further contextualizing them. So our respondents perceive that the trust in public institutions is kind of eroding, and that factual information does not count that much anymore in the current environment. Some of them report difficulties in identifying which information is reliable themselves. As one Czech respondent notes, that they are losing a bit of awareness of what's true and what's not. In this context, our respondents perceive that journalism is only gradually able to increase the factuality of public discourses because they report increasing bypassing of journalistic media by social media platforms, for instance, where political actors kind of avoid journalism altogether. In this domain, journalists report relatively distinct coping strategies of how they want to resolve these tensions. On the one hand, they strive for more transparency, so as one respondent calls it, to regain the trust among the people. Respondents also explain that they want to be more transparent about the inner working of journalism and the mechanisms within newsrooms to their audiences. Some respondents even conceptualized these kind of meta-explanation as a distinct new role of journalism. The journalists in our sample also stress that they aim to contextualize news events to a broader extent and provide background knowledge, because this is what they perceive to be the unique and distinct value of professional journalism in comparison to other forms of communication. Third and last, we find that the enactment of advocative roles, here more understood as speaking on behalf of marginalized and on behalf of disadvantaged, is perceived as both a source of tension but also as a potential response to democratic backsliding. Respondents problematize that they're increasingly accused of acting as activists if they enact advocative roles, particularly from within their news organization. One respondent from Germany, for instance, explains that if you're somehow involved in topics that have something to do with justice, there's often the suspicion that you're making common cause with someone or with something. At the same time, journalists report that advocative roles are exactly what is needed in times of democratic backsliding, and they perceive it as necessary response to what a Czech respondent calls the dehumanization of a certain segment of the population that they perceive as being part of democratic decline. So altogether, what I think we can learn from this sub-study is that the analysis of journalistic role enactment can serve as a kind of a seismograph of democratic decline, even when democracy is on a comparably high level, which we can clearly see in the 6 countries under investigation. I think what it also shows is that journalists are currently facing, probably not surprising, considerable tensions, and it's an open question at what point and how these tensions kind of change the institutional core of journalism, because we expect journalists not endlessly kind of cope with such tensions, but at some point that might change the journalistic roles they perceive as important altogether. And lastly, I think we can observe what could be called the renegotiation of journalism's roles in gradually declining democracies, and it is exactly as our empirical data could show, informational, critical, and advocative roles where journalists kind of look for answers most strongly. So possibly we find some answers in our discussion right now as well. Thank you.
journalists described are mapping to funding sources and the funding processes. That's my question. Do I need to say more?
Anyone else? Yes.
We didn't ask for it.
Okay.
Thank you for this presentation.
A bit louder.
I was wondering,
Yeah.
I was wondering if, I think we can say that each of these roles can be practiced with a different degree of intensity. And regarding the advocacy role, do you have a view of where we could draw the line between advocacy and activism? Like you talked about the fact that there were told there were being activists very often, but that's the point. Like, do you have an opinion on where was the core difference between the two? Thank you.
I mean, I clearly agree with you. These roles are not kind of fixed constructs. Journalists rather have a repertoire on roles which they kind of enact in different circumstances or not to different degrees. So it's not that, of course not, that journalists kind of only enact this one role all the time. Concerning the boundaries between advocative roles and activism, in the interviews we saw that journalists had specific reasons why they choose a certain form of advocacy. For instance, I remember interviews where journalists talk about gender-fair language, where they, for instance, had empirical evidence that makes a difference, but still they were accused of kind of acting as activists if they used that. So I remember cases from interviews that journalists reflect a lot on where to draw the boundary, and they often brought evidence, often empirical evidence, why they would kind of enact certain form of advocacy, but they still faced that criticism. So that was kind of the central tension, that they thought they had valid reasons, they could communicate these reasons transparently, but they still were accused of acting as activists, and that was kind of the major problem we encountered in our interviews. Of course, we cannot draw this line.
In an ideal world, the line between advocacy and activism would be that someone engaging in advocacy speaks for a group, while activism is someone who speaks being part of the group. That is the distinction, which is often in journalism very difficult to navigate because, just to give you an example, we have seen quite a few cases where journalists have been drawn into conflicts, like ethnic conflicts or religious conflicts, and there journalists were simply drawn into these conflicts because they're inevitably part of either group, and so it's very difficult for them to distinguish themselves or distinguish between advocacy and activism. And so what I would say is that this is a distinction that we can talk about in theoretical terms, but for many journalists, that is a conundrum they face in practice.
Good morning. I thank you very much. I think these are very interesting insights. I have a question because we more and more distinguish journalism and media, and many of the journalists are getting increasingly frustrated by being forced to work within a media environment that goes more and more into the direction of either captured or clickbait, or we talk about the term platformization of the media. So I don't know if you discussed also the relationship between the journalist, the editor-in-chief, or the media that still sets the tone when it comes to the journalistic work. I don't know if I made it clear.
Well, that was not a specific aspect of the study, but I mean that's a major trope in general journalism research, and I think I mentioned this yesterday. that there is a surprising thing that we find in many of those studies is that objectively we know that there's a lot of organizational, economic, otherwise influence imposed on journalists' everyday work. But if you ask them how much autonomy they enjoy, they, in most European countries, they would tell you, well, I have a lot of autonomy. It's a great job, I love it, and I have almost all autonomy it takes. But it seems to me that many of these influences, especially economic influences, are typically filtered by, for instance, newsroom leadership and then transformed into organizational influence. So that many, let me say, rank and file journalists do not necessarily recognize those influences as economic. So to them it appears like it's organizational constraints, it's the nature of journalistic work. So over time, many of these influences have been incorporated into that's how we work, naturalized, and have become invisible. Not sure if that answers your question, but that is a consistent finding that we see in many empirical studies.
No, that's interesting. I think the journalist union's perspective is clearly a little bit different, but I find it interesting. I don't know. Anybody else?
Well, it's really great study. Thank you for doing this job. I'm interested, I don't know if that was the topic or question, the journalist's opinion about this, how to call it, new kids on the block. And I'm not sure, maybe the code of conduct for journalistic profession, is there something that these new actors are aware of, familiar with, and do they have any opinion about it if you maybe ask them for that? Thank you.
You mean ethical conduct, yes. Ethical norms and standards?
Yes.
No, we haven't asked the question in our interviews because the qualitative interviews were much more about how does the shifting political context influence journalists' mindsets. But what I said very early in my presentation is that one could expect that someone who self-identifies as a journalist, to some extent also follow an ethical framework of journalism. But since many of these peripheral actors do not fall into the category of a traditional journalist, they are legally not, or they professionally not required to do so, and which is one more reason why I think it's important to reconsider those boundaries, because it would be important to incorporate those new actors into the established normative framework of journalism, and so we can extend our expectations that we typically have on traditional journalists also to certain subgroups of actors in the periphery of journalism, just to make sure that they also adhere to professional standards we typically also expect from journalists.
Anyone else? No. Let's have a coffee break. Coffee break. Sorry.
Oh, there's one more.
Go ahead.
This is a bit peripheral, but there is a group of journalists who were sacked from their jobs and went into PR, public relations. Are they a category that we're interested in or not? They're kind of lost souls, but they go into corporate PR. But if they go into NGOs and say work on the climate, are they still journalists or not? Is it?
Yeah.
Where do you place them?
We had the discussion yesterday because there was a colleague doing a lot of journalistic work on behalf of NGOs, and well, it's probably because we focused on Europe. Had we done a study on African journalism, we would certainly have included NGO journalism because there are large parts in Central Africa where people are served by NGO journalists simply because NGOs are pumping a lot of money into quality journalism. Otherwise, people in these parts of the world would have very little access to quality journalism. But NGO journalism is not extremely widespread in most European countries. This is why it hasn't been on our map. I have a former doctoral student of mine. She focused her study on exited journalists, so journalists who left the profession. So where did they end up? How do they feel? And what she found, just in a nutshell, was that many journalists who were forced to leave the profession, they ended up in PR, as you say, in corporate communication. They still feel as a journalist. So because the journalistic self-identification is still traveling with them, even though they started a new job. So this positive feel they attach to working as a journalist is still there. And many of them actually regret having left journalism, although at the time they left journalism, there was no other choice. So, but we didn't specifically look at these people in the current study.